All right, boys, I'll let you pass that out. You got your stopwatch, Gail? Got it on? I told her last week I was going to do the first 19 chapters of Revelation in 10 minutes, but she can't start it till I say start, okay? So, because we're going to start 20 tonight, and just by way of a really brief review, don't forget, as we go through this, Revelation is what kind of book? Which means it is what? Figurative. And the mode through which this vision is given to us is through the use of what? Symbols or pictures. The pictures represent things for us to see. Okay, and don't forget, this letter was written to who? 7 churches of Asia. Now, I did read an interesting article this week. What does 7 represent? Perfect and complete. There were more than 7 churches in Asia when Revelation was written. So the idea of this being written to 7 churches might also mean what? It's written to the church, the complete church. Now, he highlights 7 different churches, obviously real churches who are experiencing real issues. But those issues, as we looked at the very beginning, are indicative of the church nationwide, of all the kinds of things we could face, of all the kind of temptations we may face. I thought that was interesting. I never thought about it before, how the use of 7, even in that context, is brought out. Okay, Paul?
There's also some number of 4 for the earth and 3 for the Godhead. 4 plus 3 is 7.
Right.
So it's heaven and earth
Complete. But as it's talking about the church, I like the idea of the totality of the church, which we've seen represented with the 12 and the 12 all throughout. Okay, so the first couple of chapters, we get these letters to the church, and then the Revelation starts. You ready? Okay, go. We saw right off the bat, who's in control? God's in control. We see the throne room. We see the 4 living creatures before the throne. The image that's conveyed to these 7 churches is Caesar may think he's in control, but God is in control. And then all of a sudden what shows up is a scroll that's perfectly sealed with 7 seals. And no one can be found to open the seals until one who looks as if it is slain. The Lamb comes on the scene. He's identified as who? Jesus. And he begins to open the seals. And the seals are how many? 7. It's perfectly sealed, and it talks about the coming judgment of God on the oppressors of God's people. All right? And then we see right off the bat kind of this future indication of what's going to happen. Jesus is represented by this rider on this white horse as he comes in. We see the second rider who is riding on a red horse, which represents what? Remember? Got sword, war. Right? And then the third rider comes in, famine, economic distress, whatever. And then lastly, the rider on the pale horse represented what? Death. And we kind of see in one picture the future of what maybe some of these saints in these 7 churches are going to experience as judgment comes upon the enemy of God. Okay, but right in the middle of these seals that start happening, and remember, these seals represented total or partial judgment. Partial off the bat. Remember, 1/3 of the mankind or 1/3 of the waters. This is God trying to get their attention. And we see, though, about the 6th seal, we see this altar in the middle of heaven, and under the altar were the souls of those who had been what? Martyred. And they asked a question. And what was the question they asked of God? How long until what? Not Judgment Day. How long until we are avenged? In other words, we were killed because of our faithfulness and our testimony, and now how long until that's going to happen? And God gives them a message. He tells them to do what? Wait. Be patient. Be patient. All right? And so we see this continual seals open up, and we see God's judgment starting to be poured out. But in the middle of it, we see 7 angels show up with 7 trumpets, and more judgment now is coming upon who? Who is the enemy of God at this time? Satan is ultimately the enemy of God, but Satan is working through who? Rome and all of her agents. And we see the trumpets. Now, again, is this total judgment coming upon Rome or still partial? Still partial. And remember the question that always comes back at the end of it. God says this, they still did not what? Repent. All throughout all of these judgments, the seals, the trumpets, it's God's desire that all should come to repentance. Okay? But remember, this message is not to Rome, it's to who? Christians. It's to the 7 churches to remain faithful even though you may be under that judgment. All right? And even though judgment is coming, we see this picture of the 2 witnesses. We see the picture of the 2 olive trees and how the olive trees flow straight into the candlesticks. And that represented the message or the testimony of the gospel. And despite what's going on in the world, it's Christians' job is to still proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. And if you remember, the witnesses who testified, what happened to them? Come on, what? You're killing my time here. What happened? They got killed. And what happened to their bodies? Left in the street. But what did God do? He raised them back up. Again, symbolic of what? The ever-enduring power of the gospel of God. Doesn't matter what's going to happen. It's always going to be there. And then we're introduced to the dragon. It's got how many heads? That's always a good answer, guys. Just always throw 7 out. Okay? 7, 12, 3.5. It works. And the dragon comes, the representative of who? Satan. And he's attacking the woman who's about to what? Give birth. Who's this all symbolic of? Some say the woman represents the gospel, giving birth to the gospel, but Jesus Christ, we know how Satan attacked even the birth of Christ through Herod. We see this all the way back, bared out even in Genesis. Okay? Pharaoh wanted to kill the who? Firstborn, babies, right? And we see this played out over and over and over again. But what happens to the woman? Carried away. Satan's a 4-time what? Loser, right? And so he fails in his attempt to get the woman, to get the child, and then he turns his attention on heaven. And what happens in heaven? There's a fight, and he fails again. And Michael and his angels, they had this battle, and Satan's thrown down where? To the earth, right? Where he's ticked off. So he enlists the aid of 2 helpers. Remember the beast out of the sea and the beast out of the earth. Representative of what? Rome's what? 2 different aspects of Rome. Political power and well, I mean, the political military is on one side, the emperor worship, the false prophets on the other, kind of the religious aspect of Rome. In other words, you got to bow down to Rome and claim Caesar as Lord. Okay, we see this take place. And then God says what? I have had enough. And we see how many angels? 7. There you go. And they got how many bowls? 7. There you go. And are they full or halfway full? They're full. Full of what? The wrath of God. Now we see judgment coming. All right? And we talked about that. We talked about how as this judgment's poured out, it's kind of like the plagues of Egypt. We saw the rivers turn to blood. We saw the hailstones from the earth. We saw the frogs. We saw all of this stuff going on, right? Judgment of God. And then we see the harlot riding upon the beast. And the harlot was representative of who? Rome, riding upon the beast of her political might. And what happened to the harlot? What's that? She was drunk on the blood of the saints, but was she judged? Yes, she was. And then just last week we talked about how the battle, and we talked about Megiddo and where Megiddo is. In the Bible, it's referred to as what? Armageddon. Har meaning hill, the hill of Megiddo or Har Megiddo. It's a battle place known in history, and what has always taken place there? What's that? Jewish people. Israel has always won. But what kind of battle was it? Was it a fair fight? Equal sides? No, it wasn't. What was it? They were always outnumbered. God's people were always outnumbered. Small force versus large force. And the small force of God, what? Always won. They always won. All right, so when we see this battle of Armageddon, and remember, we talked about it last night. How is the battle described? It's not. It's not. The forces came up and God did what? Wiped them out. We're going to see it again as we jump into 20. And what happens? We see the rider on the white horse again, Jesus coming victorious. Oh, I'm sorry. Need some? There you go. He's coming victorious. His sword's coming out of his mouth, and we saw what happened. He wiped them out. As a matter of fact, it doesn't even mention the army that's coming behind him doing anything other than being there in support. And as a result, the beast from the sea, the beast from the earth are thrown down in the lake of fire. Okay? That's where we left it. How long was that? 7 minutes. Oh, yes. Had 2.5 minutes left. What's that? That was for a turtle Sunday? Oh, dude, okay. I can do it in 5. I thought you were just going. I thought, oh, she sent me a picture of a Turtle Sunday that said it's on like Donkey Kong. And I was like, I didn't know we were betting for Turtle Sundays now. But that's cool. I can do that. All right, let's go to 20. And I got to tell you, I don't know if I can get through this tonight. I hope I can because I want to get to the good part of Revelation's coming. Okay? Because when we finish 20, Satan is going to be dealt with once and for all. Okay? And then we get into probably the most, Revelation's a funny book in the sense that the first 3 chapters get preached a lot and the last 3 chapters get preached a lot, and nobody wants to talk about the middle. Because the first 3 chapters are the letters to the 7 churches, and everybody can make application there. And the last 3 chapters of Revelation are about what? Heaven. We're going to finish judgment pretty much in 20. And then we got heaven coming. And it's a beautiful description of what we have to look forward to as Christians. Okay? And it's exactly what these people need. But we got to get through 20 to get there. All right? So let's just jump right on in. Revelation chapter 20. Let's take on the first 3 verses. Now, I will say this. A couple of words to pay attention to in this chapter. And a couple of things I want to point out before we even get there. Okay? There are some major theological positions that are derived completely from chapter 20. Okay? You've heard of premillennialism. You've heard of postmillennialism. Both of those are derived from what we will read in Revelation chapter 20. Okay? But there's another type of millennialism. It's called amillennialism. Premillennialism, in case you didn't know, is a theological term that describes a belief that Christ is going to come and then there's going to be 1,000 years of peace on the earth and then judgment will take place and we'll all go to heaven. That's premillennialism. In other words, Christ will come pre the millennial, the 1,000 years. Okay? Postmillennialism believes there's going to be 1,000 years on earth of peace for the church, and then Christ is going to come. Okay? Got it? It'll be on the test in a couple of weeks. Premillennialism, postmillennialism. Amillennialism simply doesn't believe in a literal 1,000-year reign of any kind on the earth. Now let me ask you this. Up until this point, the numbers, the pictures, everything we've seen have been what? Figurative, symbolic. Okay, we've talked about it. 3.5 represents something that's incomplete. 7 represents something that's total or complete. 10 represents what? Complete, perfection, whatever. Anything to the 10th power, complete, perfection. 12 represents what? Come on. 12 apostles, 12 tribes. 12 would indicate what? God's people, the church. Okay. All right. Now, as I said from the beginning, we began with a hermeneutical principle that says as we work through this, we're going to interpret it as symbolic as we go. In other words, we're not going to start off symbolic and then we're going to say, okay, well, this part's figurative, and then we're going to go, or literal, and then we're going to go back and say this is symbolic as well. With that hermeneutical principle in place, and understand, when you're taking on a text like this, it's apocalyptic like this, you can't start with one interpretive principle and then change and then go back and forth. Whatever you start with, you got to end with, okay? And we started with that principle, so we have to carry it through, especially chapter 20, because in chapter 20, we can't get to a point where we said, okay, everything's figurative up to this point. There's not really a 7-headed dragon. That represents Satan. And we get to this point, and we hear the word 1,000 years, and we go, yeah, but that's literal. You see the problem? If every number, if every date, if every time frame up to this point has been figurative, then what we read in 20 must also be figurative. It's symbolic of something. So it's ours to figure out symbolic of what. Okay? Keep that in mind as we go through this. All right. Let's jump in. Verse 1, then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit, or the abyss, and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him and threw him into the pit, and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he may not deceive the nations any longer, until the 1,000 years were ended, and after that he must be released for a while. Okay. If you remember all the way back to chapter 9, okay, the first time we saw the abyss, Satan is pictured as this star who's fallen from heaven. But in that text, who had the key to the abyss? Remember? Satan did. Satan held the key to the abyss in chapter 9. Who holds the key now? God does. An angel does. I have to assume it was given to him by God. Okay? Understand, he's been defeated. And he sees this angel with this key coming down out of heaven. Now, this is important. This is important because remember, we have seen through our study of Revelation, some things are shown to us from the perspective of heaven, and some things are shown to us from the perspective of earth. Okay? In other words, we see what's going on in heaven. We also see what's going on in the earth. We saw that when judgment started coming. Okay, if John sees an angel coming down, from what perspective is he looking? He's looking from the earth. So this is kind of a clue to tell us from what perspective we're looking at here. Okay? From what view we're supposed to interpret the vision from, so to speak. So we're going to be talking about, we can see not what's going to be happening in heaven, but what's going to be happening on the earth. And this angel has in his hand a great chain. And this picture is that Satan is bound. He's locked up. They throw him in the pit for 1,000 years. Now, what does this picture convey to these 7 churches? What is the picture? What's the message? What do you get from this? God's in control of Satan. What else do you get from it? What's that? Powerless. He's locked up. He's bound up.
History there, the serpent of old. So he's referring all the way from Genesis all the way through.
Okay. Serpent of old. Long time nemesis. Okay. Again, we see these terms. Okay. Think about this for a minute. This is where the post-millennialists derive a theology that says there's going to be peace on earth because Satan's bound and he's not going to deceive the world anymore. So there's not going to be any influence of Satan, okay, for 1,000 years, after which time the Lord will come, okay? But let me ask you this. In Psalms, God is referred to as the owner of the cattle on what? 1,000 hills. What about the cattle on hill number 1001? Who owns that? God does. Why do we know that? What's that? He owns everything. But beyond that, why do we know that? It's figure of speech. It's hyperbole. It's saying, you know, matter of fact, later on, I think it's Isaiah, I'm not positive, but where it says the Lord will keep his covenant for 1,000 generations, right? What about the 1,001st generation? Is he not going to keep it then? Now we know that's not a literal representation of 1,000 years. It's figurative of God's always in control. God's always going to keep his covenant. God owns everything. And in this case, what is this symbolic of? God is sometimes in control of Satan, but when? Always in control. Always. Always. Okay? So the devil's bound totally and completely. He's locked and sealed for 1,000 years. And what these people in this church needed to understand was no matter what they perceived to be going on in their lives as persecution rains down on them, who's in control? God is. Who ultimately can do whatever he wants. God can. Okay? You see this picture coming through loud and clear. All right? Questions, thoughts? That's a lot. Okay? Paul?
The real short version is that when our country was founded, it was actually a real popular view. Many people thought, well, America is the nation that's going to usher in this 1,000 years of peace.
The millennial, right.
And that manifest destiny and all those kind of things until the Civil War.
Right.
And then after that, you don't hear too much about this.
Well, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Because for that very reason, there's been a whole lot of premillennialists and postmillennialists, I can't even say that fast, who've had to revise their timetables from taking this literally, okay? Because every time they think the Antichrist has showed up or the beast has showed up, then what follows is the 1,000 years of, and it never happens. And they're like, wait a minute, oh, then he must not have been, right? That's the problem with trying to take it all literally because it just doesn't work. Let's keep going. Verse 4. Listen to what he says. We get these kind of back and forth pictures. Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they will be the priests of God and of Christ. They will reign with him for 1,000 years. Okay, again, we get the 1,000 years over and over again. Okay? But 1,000 is a number that represents what? Perfect. Completion, total completion. It's 10 to the 10th power, I think. Is that right? Okay, whatever. 10 times 10 times 10. There you go. Some of y'all passed math. I didn't. Okay? But we see it. But you get these not contradictory, but almost opposing images. You got Satan on one side being bound and thrown into a pit, and the other vision is of who? Saints around the throne, been committed the authority to judge. You got thrones, so we're talking about heaven again. Those who, look at the description. Who is John seeing? Who's he seeing? A bunch of headless people? It says they were what? Mine says they were all beheaded. We're not talking physical here. We're seeing the souls of these people who have been martyred for their testimony, for their faithfulness. Again, important to remember, who's the book written to? 7 churches who are having a problem with being faithful. So the image is, look what happens when you're faithful. Look what happens when you follow God. Even as bad as it may seem, look what you have to look forward to. Those who did not worship the beast or his image and had not received the mark on their foreheads. We see this. John in Revelation 4, we saw the 24 other thrones around the throne of God, the 24 elders sitting upon them, those who hadn't worshiped the beast. And I think it's interesting to say that they came to life, okay, which tells us something about what we can expect. And if hold your finger there and go all the way back to Revelation chapter 1, okay? Revelation chapter 1. There's a description in verse 4. Okay, here we go. I haven't planned on doing this. John, to the 7 churches that are in Asia, grace to you and peace from him. Now we get this threefold description of Jesus, okay? Who is, who was, and who is to come, okay? From the 7 spirits who are before this throne, and now from Jesus Christ. How's he first described? Faithful witness. Then what's the second? The firstborn from the dead. And then lastly, the what? Ruler of the kings of earth. By the time we get to chapter 20, here we get this picture of the souls who have lost their lives for their testimony, for their faithfulness to God. And yet what happens to them? They come to life, right? And don't forget the description of Jesus in chapter 1 that they would have remembered was that he was the who from the dead? Firstborn, which means he's not the lastborn, he's the firstborn, and there will be others to follow. Okay? I could spend an entire hour just on that verse, but that's really cool. When you think about it, as we come full circle from the description of Jesus in chapter 1 to the end where the promise is being fulfilled to these folks, you will live again, and we'll talk about how in just a minute. All right? Actually, go back to 3:21 if you want. The promise there to the church at Laodicea was this: to him who overcomes, I will give the right to sit with me on my throne, just as I overcame and sat down with my Father who's on his throne. Even in chapter 3, the promise is if you overcome, you'll end up sitting where? On a throne by God. By the time we get to verse chapter 20, what do we see these saints who were faithful? Where are they sitting? On the throne. In other words, it's like, I'm going to tell you what you need to do, and now I'm going to show you how it all plays out. And that's where we're at. Okay? Then we get the rest of the dead. Okay? The rest of the dead, those who did worship the beast, they did receive his number and mark. There's a contrast here between the saints that came to life and reigned with Christ and the rest of the dead. What happened to them? They stayed dead. For how long? 1,000 years. Which is symbolic of what? Until God wanted them to do something with them. In other words, it's God's timing. God's going to seal them up. God's going to take care of them until he's ready to do something. Now, what happens? Do they come to life? They will. Only to experience what he refers to as the second death. They will be brought back to die again. Okay? Those who didn't receive the mark, will they experience the second death? No. That's us. That's us. Death is certain for every single one of us unless the Lord decides to come back. Okay? And I don't care how many pills you take. I don't care how many miles you run. I don't care how much fruit you eat. As healthy as you want to be, guess what's going to happen? You're going to die. Unless Jesus comes back. Okay? You're going to die. But understand this, for the Christian, you're only going to die once. And for the Christian, the one we serve has already defeated death. So it's just a gateway to the next existence for us. Okay? Questions, thoughts? I see heads spinning. Anything? I know I'm kind of going quick. Too fast? I get really excited when I get towards the end because this is the good part. Okay? You got to get through all the thirds and thirds and thirds to get to the full one so you can get to the end. Right? Okay, this is like watching 3/4 of a movie and then having to turn it off. You don't want to see the ending. Okay? That's where we're getting to. All right. These saints, they're benefiting from the first resurrection. He said, blessed and holy are those who have part in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them, but they will be priests of God and of Christ and will reign with him for 1,000 years. They're blessed first because the second death has no power over them. 2014 says the lake of fire is the second death. We know that's not in our future. Second, the saints were blessed because they were holy. It says they're going to serve as priests in the holy place. This is a place no one could enter. This is a place where the high priest only could go. And here he says you're all going to be there in the very presence of God. Okay? Right. Actually, we're going to talk about this Sunday. The idea of the priesthood of saints is not something that's new to the New Testament, although Israel had a Levitical priesthood. If you go all the way back to Genesis, when Moses was arguing with Pharaoh to get Israel released, the terms by which God says he wants Israel released is so they will all be priests. It was God's intent from the beginning that Israel be a nation of priests. Okay, because it was God's intent. I got to stop because this is what I'm preaching Sunday. Okay, but understand, God has always wanted us to be priests, to serve and to worship with Him in His presence. Okay, that's God's design from the beginning. That's God's plan to get us back to that place. Okay, so yeah, the culmination of what He's saying, and understand, He calls us priests. Now, typically, we think of priests in a servant role. Right? They serve at the altar. They serve in the temple. But also understand, he says that these saints will do what with God? Reign with God. And you know why? Why do we reign with God? We're part of the royal family. Right? I mean, if dad's the king, that makes me a what? Prince. Right, I can live with Prince. Okay, I can live with that. That's who He tells us we are. He adopts us as His sons into the royal family of God. Now we'll get into that in just a minute about how that takes place. Exactly. Don't be preaching my sermon on Sunday, Paul. No, we're going to get there. Okay? So do you see, let me just ask you this. Do you see how this message, this picture, would be encouragement to these 7 churches? You see how they would find power, how they would find comfort in knowing that the God that some of them are being put to death for because of their testimony, because of their faithfulness. Can you see how these images that John is bringing to them of heaven and their future, how that would give them courage? It would cause them to be faithful. But also understand, nothing has changed. We still live in a world in which Christianity is persecuted. It's oppressed. Now, maybe not totally in this country. I think we're getting more and more there. Get out of the bounds of this country and go to some other countries, and you will find people daily who are put to death because of their belief in Jesus Christ. You will find people today, godly people, who are in jail because they believe in Jesus Christ. You will find people whose homes are burned, whose businesses are ransacked, whose money's taken, they are persecuted to the nth degree because they believe in Jesus Christ. It still goes on today. And the reality is sometimes we get a little bit of it here. Someone might be offended at our Easter picture or whatever and say something about it, and we go, oh, well, I'm being persecuted. Well, maybe, but maybe you've been burned in oil or sawn in half or, anything like that lately. I think the persecution, we have it pretty light. We have it pretty good, okay? Anyway, let's keep moving. I got to keep track of my time here. Okay. I got to get to 7 because here's where more bad theology comes. When the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the 4 corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle, and their number is like the sand of the sea. And they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints, the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them, and the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Okay. Picture of what? What? Another battle. Satan's on the loose, and he raises up an army. Sound familiar? Sound familiar? He did it in the first century. He continues to do it today. He hasn't stopped. Okay? Understand that. The picture of Satan being bound completely is different than the picture of Satan being bound permanently. Right? I can lock somebody up completely. Doesn't mean I've locked them up permanently. And some may ask, well, if God had him locked up, why did he let him out? Any thoughts? For judgment, maybe? But remember, Revelation is what kind of a book? figurative. It's figurative. Okay? It's symbolic. The idea of Satan being bound, to me, it's simply telling these first century Christians in these 7 churches, listen, there's going to come a point in time where you're not going to have to worry about the effects of Rome anymore. That threat of Satan is done. It's done. Okay? Let me ask you this. Before Rome, were God's people ever persecuted? By who? Yeah. Take your pick. Babylonians, Medo-Persians, Greeks. There's judgment coming. We're going to get to that. We're not quite there. Oh, those judgments. Yeah. God uses nations all the time. And remember, this is symbolic of Satan's attempts to come at the woman, to come at the child. This is Satan's attempts to come at the church. Satan has been coming at the church and at the offspring of God since when? Genesis 3. Genesis 3. This battle really started. Right? And ever since, Satan has done everything in his power to come at the people of God. And every time Satan comes at the people of God, what does God do? Knocks them down. And now we get this other picture. Satan's going to come back, okay? He's not going to use Rome this time. He's going to use somebody else. And this time, he's going to gather Gog and Magog. And we're all going, who? Yeah, that face right there. Who? This is where being a first century Jew is really helpful, because you would have known the book of Ezekiel backwards and forwards. Okay? The prophecy in the book of Ezekiel, the first 24 chapters of Ezekiel, is basically a warning about Jerusalem and how Jerusalem's going to fall. And then the next 24 chapters of Ezekiel talks about how all the other nations are going to fall. But then at the end, it's not 24 and 24, maybe it's 12 and 12, yeah. And then at the end, it's Jerusalem's going to be comforted, though. Israel's going to be comforted, although God's going to come in judgment of them. And then we get 38 and 39 in Ezekiel. We get this picture of Gog and Magog, this humongous force that comes against the city of God. Okay? This force is bigger than any force that's ever been seen on the planet. As a matter of fact, I'll just let you guys go read it, but 38 and 39 is really cool. The battle takes place, God intervenes, and all of a sudden, the dead from Gog and Magog are everywhere. As a matter of fact, it says the Israelites spent all day, every day, for 7 months burying the dead. Okay? And what it was a picture like Megiddo, like Armageddon. Here's this small force against an innumerable force, and God intervenes, and the innumerable force dies. Now, is that a repeatable theme in the Bible? It is the repeatable theme in the Bible. Why do you think we have the story of David and Goliath? Y'all know that, David and Goliath? David, little boy, I don't know. Some say 12, 13, maybe 16, 17, somewhere in that neighborhood, right? He wants to go fight big Goliath. Goliath's how tall? 9 feet, 10 feet tall. I can't even imagine. I saw Yao Ming at a basketball game one time in Denver, Colorado. Stood on the floor right next to him. Biggest human being I've ever seen in my life. Dude, 7'3", 7'4", I don't know. Humongous, standing right next to me. And I'm like, I can't imagine another human being 2 feet taller than him. I'd have been terrified. And I'm not little, right? I can't imagine being 12, 13, or 14 looking at some dude that's 9 foot tall. What's the message? Who killed Goliath? God did. Now, he used David's sling and he used David's willingness, but make no mistake about it. You take a little rock like that and you throw it at a dude like that, right? You remember the story of Gideon and his 300? They were going up against an army of how many? 10,000. They had what? 300. And they were armed with trumpets, torches, and clay pots. It's like sending the band out to battle, right? I was in the band, I can say that. Okay? But you understand what I'm saying? And what happened? The band won. Big time. Every single time this is repeated over and over again. So we come to the end here and it says, you know what? Satan's going to rise up helpers again. He had the sea beast and the earth beast before. They've been thrown down. Now he's going to get Gog and Magog. And their armies are going to be like the sands of the seashore. Right? Now, again, we get a battle scene. Right? Satan rises up again. He gets this huge army that's got all this stuff. Millions. This, by the way, this is where some people believe that China is going to invade. Seriously, I'm not making this up. They interpret this to mean that China is going to invade and take over the world because they are the only population on earth who could raise a force anywhere near this many people because they have that many people, okay? But again, that's trying to take something literal that was meant to be figurative. The idea is, now, what happens? This humongous army comes and it encapsulates the city of God, and the battle takes place? Nope. What happens? Fire of God comes down. Over. Gone. Done. Done. What's the message for us? Again, Revelation, 2 words. What is it? We win. It doesn't matter how big the army of Satan is. Guess what? We win. Why? Because we've got God on our side. Okay?
Roman Empire to all the nations.
To what?
To all the nations.
Sure. And we've seen it over and over again. And I tell you this, we will see it over and over again until Jesus comes back. Okay? Until Jesus comes back. And then we get a picture at the end, after that takes place, of what happens. And Satan is where? He's cast down where the sea beast is. He's cast down where the land beast is. He's cast down where those who receive the mark, and he's there. Okay? And then we begin to see the flip side. Okay? I'm going to stop there because I don't want to get into the cool part, the great white throne. Go ahead, Boyd. Questions?
You spoke of a parallel to what happened to the Syrians.
Syrians? Sure.
Fire that came from heaven, but it was a disease or a plague or something that killed 185,000.
Right. And we will have seen, we will see this take place historically time and time and time and time again. Okay? We see it. I mean, there are those who can take World War II and throw it into this. Okay? And see the persecution that came upon the Jews as a result of the Holocaust. And then you see God using other nations put that down. Okay? We see this taking place over and over again. Okay.
World War II, Hitler said this is the Third Reich. It's going to last
1,000
1,000 years.
years. He had, pulled from Revelation chapter 20. He believed literally in that. Not that I don't believe he believed a whole lot of the rest of the Bible, but go ahead. Right. Right.
So he prayed, he sought the word of God, and asked, he received.
Yeah. And we see that motif again or transposed and played out over and over and over and over. When you ask, now we take this back to the New Testament church. You ask and you receive, especially when it comes to God's people. And so I guess the encouragement for those 7 churches in that day was, you know what, you're going to face hard times and things aren't going to go the way you want them to go. And you may suffer as a Christian and you may die as a Christian, but you know what, that's not the worst thing that can happen. As a matter of fact, it might be the very best thing that can happen because you get to that throne that much sooner, okay? But then next week we see where John sees this throne and we see scrolls and we see a book of life that's opened up, and we'll talk about what that entails next week and the judgment that comes as a result, okay? Thanks for, I know I was fast tonight, but I had to get my Freddy's Turtle Sunday, so no, I'm kidding. Tonight, we're going to sing a song. I know we always do because we want to give anybody the opportunity. If you need anything, if you need prayers, if you need encouragement, if you need to respond to the gospel, we're always ready to do whatever you need. Just let us know as we stand and sing this song.